In the last lesson, we introduced how to use a web view. And what we did was we opened up a web browser, essentially in our application with no restrictions whatsoever. And we allowed the user to enter in any web address that they wanted to. And on top of that, we used HTTP, so we used non-secure links. Probably not the best practice overall. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how to restrict where the user can go. We have the same storyboard with our text view for our address, our button to go, and our web view. And that's all remains the same. In our view controller, we still have our button go touched event, and we're still using the address that the user enters, and we're still using HTTP, creating our URL request, and loading our web view. So all of that is the same. What we've added is we're going to implement the UI web view delegate. Mistake. We're going to implement the UI web view delegate interface. And we'll do that with this one method down here. The web view should start load with request. And what this is asking is when the user enters in a request and the web view starts to load that address, it asks if it can or if it should. And we can simply return a Boolean value, false if we don't want the web view to load that address, and true if we do want to. It passes us an SURL request object called request. From that object, we can get the URL, and we can get the URL's absolute string. So typically what we want to do is we want to take a look at the address that they've passed in and determine whether we want to pass it along or not. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to disallow the user going to Microsoft.com. It's an Apple thing. More likely, you would probably want to restrict them to the specific domain that you want to keep them in. So it would be a little bit different. You'd allow them to go to yourdomain.com as opposed to just trying to outlaw the other domains. You would do it in basically the same way, however. So we've gotten our address string, and I'm just logging that here so we can take a look at what we actually get. And then I check the address using the range of string method, and I'm looking for Microsoft.com, and I'm going to do a case-insensitive search. If it's not nil, that means that our address does contain Microsoft.com. I'm going to log that we're going to refuse that request, and then I'll return false, and that will prohibit the web view from going and processing the request, so it won't make the request at all to that URL. Otherwise, we're all good. We're going to return true, and that will allow the web view to make the request and return and display whatever the response is. So let's see what happens when we get rejected. So let's go to Google first, like we did before, and we can see that works fine. So let's try Microsoft. Spelled correctly. And nothing happens. And down in my log, you can see the request was refused. Now you'll note the web view didn't show anything. So it didn't change state at all. It didn't give the user any kind of indication as to why the request refused or anything like that. You could pop up a message, or you could just have this behavior and say, well, we're just not going to let you go. Either way would be fine, and depends on what your application's requirements and what your user's needs are. So let's look at this another way. And we'll try to sneak in the back door using Google. Let's try the download center. And again, we can see I got my mistake. And again, we can see that request was refused. So you can't sneak in that way either. So that's a way to control what your user can use the web view for. And it's actually probably pretty important that your application does that, because after all, you're not really in the business of writing a general browser. We already have one on the device anyway.